community work in Ireland, issues and interactions in 2021. Goodness, I'm beginning to age myself very rapidly. And I want to do so currently as the chair of the All Ireland Endorsement Body for Community Work Education and Training. But as some of you know, I've also been for many years associated with Community Work Ireland and also with Maynooth University. And we were very glad in Maynooth to have hosted, in fact, the first World Community Development Conference in 2018. And very glad that so many of you here were able to be with us. And Ciara, thank you very much for helping me to make my way through these 3 or 4 slides. And let's go on to the next one because they're sick looking at my name by now. What I wanted to just, and there are only 3 slides, so it won't take too long. First of all, I think there are important things in trying to shape up to thinking about theory in Irish community work, about the historical roots. And I see Stuart Murdoch there. And in a way, what's interesting about the historical roots here is that they're somewhat mirrored to an extent in the historical roots in Scotland, as opposed to in England and maybe to some extent in Wales. So they're rooted very much in rural development, which to a large extent was quite conservative. It was about what some of us would remember as the old UN definition of community development, the state and the people coming together to do rural electrification and but as well as that, at the same time, and this is where the contradiction begins to emerge, it was rooted in urban resistance, resistance that maybe happened in the Marxist sort of movement, that, the campaigns for housing, which evolved in the large cities here in the 1960s, and particularly were associated with risings in France and other places, the student movements of the late 60s and indeed of the early 70s, and going back previous to that as well. So what was interesting about that and what continued in the EU anti-poverty programs was that these community programs and these initiatives didn't have, they did not have they didn't have social work. They had a starting point very much in collective development, whether that was of a conservative variety or whether it was of a more progressive and liberal or even radical variety. They had that very clear starting point. In a way, the success of these moved in the 2000s to some preset national programs. And the ones that you may be familiar with in this regard are things like the EU Leader Rural Development Programme, which up until its last iteration didn't have any obligation to deal with social inclusion, for example, and in a way was mostly concerned with a slight movement away from the farm gate in terms of controlling or in terms of supporting agriculture and agricultural development throughout the European Union. So, and the other one, preset national programme, is what's now called the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme. And that, in a sense, bracketed community development as an action, which had to be quantified. And in a way, also contested very much the ground which had begun to frame community work very much as something that came from the ground up and where decisions were made locally in projects. An associated move was towards the group work that might be undertaken as support of the family or support of the individual. So what was happening in both of these developments is one, that aims for community development and community work were being set, objectives were being set at national level in preset programs that had preset targets, which totally contradicted any of the empowering processes that people were attempting to be involved in. Or on the other hand, were preset around achieving outcomes for individuals rather than moving with those for outcomes for groups. And I will later, there's lots of literature which can easily help us to sort of to capture this focus. But one of the things that did happen throughout this period is that at a national level, through what is now Community Work Ireland and through a National Association for Community Workers that continued, there was a continued policy focus and a continued attempt to influence developments and to attempt to shape them. not always successfully, I might add, because if they had been that successful, there wouldn't have been these preset national programs. So moving rapidly along then to the current day, we reached, with a certain degree of desperation, we reached COVID at the beginning of last year. And COVID suddenly brought another focus on community and what I would describe as a contained community response. Communities were invited to engage. Community became a very operative term. But what was requested was a very contained community response, that communities would be responsible. And in effect, I would suggest an implication in the instrumentalization of communities. Now, for many communities, particularly for communities that had previously been associated with rural development and with a number of other urban developments as well, this was a breath of fresh air. This meant that people could have a say, even at a very local level, and were responsible for supporting people directly affected by COVID. But what it also meant was that this response was controlled. At national level, though, a coalition developed. And in effect, what this coalition, and again, we have produced 2 documents that portray this fairly clearly, what this coalition set out to do was to name the policy implications and name the larger responses that were required by COVID. And I think what's useful to look at here, what's useful to recall here, is the way in which some of those, particularly those put forward by individual groups, were actually quite successful. In the work of Pavy Point, for example, which I'm associated with and involved with, using the social determinants of health, starting with a response that was concerned with the differential effects of COVID for travellers and for Roma in Ireland, and using those differential effects within a public health framework. It was possible actually to achieve some collective rights-based outcomes that had successfully defeated us for the previous 20 years. So that for the first time, for example, the social determinants of health began to be acknowledged as a way in which health policy should be framed. Of course, a key problem now will be hanging on to that in the post-COVID era. And secondly, another organisation that I've been directly involved in and am still associated and working with, the Migrants' Rights Centre Ireland, put a lot of energy into attempting to create firewalls for undocumented migrants and for people without documents in this country. And again, because of the role that a number of these people were playing in the front line of providing services for people experiencing COVID and in the front line of a number of the health facilities, those firewalls became possible. Again, the big question will be, how will it be possible to maintain them? But at the same time, a very interesting development took place here. Just before COVID, we had an election and a change of government, and a sort of a unique coalition which brings together the Green Party in the middle of 2 centre-right parties, I think is the most efficient way to term them. But coming from that coalition, it has been possible in a very contradictory way to get support for a pilot community development programme, which reverts right back to that sort of autonomous local community development I spoke of. Now, it's a small programme and only 8 projects are going to be funded through it, and they're just about to begin at this stage. And secondly, we got support for something called AIEB, which is the All Ireland Endorsement Body for Community Work Education and Training. And one of the things that it has been possible for us to do, moving rapidly along to my last slide, in spite of a number of setbacks due to the complexities and contradictions of collective versus individual work, which I think is one of the key things that we're attempting to deal with here. One of the things that we have been able to do is to present standards for community work in Ireland, to present principles and standards which have been widely endorsed by people across the spectrum of those involved with the profession. And also we have been able, through collective participative frameworks, to get support for the idea of endorsement. Now, to be honest with you, this is complex and it's also contradictory, because the same people who are concerned with professional standards on one hand are also concerned to be an inclusive profession that everyone can be part of without any education or training, perhaps on the other hand, and finding alternative ways to do it. So that's our struggle and that's our challenge. We've also set out to frame community work as human rights practice. Again, a theoretical challenge, because a lot of human rights are framed as individual. And thirdly, we have set out to recognize racism and inclusion. Now, again, very complex. Many community projects add a focus on racism, but what we're suggesting is that we can't add a focus on racism. What we've got to do is to look at racism as it's embedded in our thinking and in our theory and in the very starting points that we come from, particularly as white community workers. And this leads me to the last point, which is where we're at now. And really this commentary is by way of encouraging you to engage with us in the last point, which is saying we have set out our principles. We've begun to look at our contradictions and our complexities. But our key challenge now is to move from those principles to a theoretical framework that adequately reflects the realities that people are facing here. We feel that theory in community work has been largely articulated by white men, British, a lot of them, and a few Americans, with all due respect to yourself, Houston, and a few Americans, and some women maybe, but not maybe tailored sufficiently, that influence has become quite dominant, and not tailored sufficiently in spite of the work from South America by people like Paulo Freire, and in spite of some of the work from Asia and from the Philippines by others who have led in radical movements over the years, and in spite of some interesting developments along the way in other arenas as well. That sort of canon needs contesting, and that's the starting point that we're at now. We believe that having had a collective frame from the beginning, that it's not, we have the beginnings of that starting point, but we think it needs to go a lot further. Thank you very much.